Hello, everybody. Welcome to this evening's broadcast. My super duper special guest this evening is Lesa Melnyczuk Morgan, who is a Ukrainian, an author, an academic, and we'll have a lot of diverse things to talk about this evening. Welcome, Lesa.
Good evening, Mike. Really nice to be here. Thank you.
And welcome to the show. Cheers.
Thank you. And cheers to you too, my friend.
Okay. Lesa, just tell the people a little bit about yourself.
Born to the initial displaced people from Ukraine. My parents were children of the forced labor group taken out of Ukraine by Hitler. And then during the war years, and then after the war, they remained in Germany in DP camps, displaced persons camps, because to go back to Ukraine, they would have been classified as traitors by Stalin and would have been executed. So you're going to see a bit of a pattern here with the goings-on occurring in Ukraine as we speak. At the end of the war, although they were in the DP camps for some years, representatives from countries like the US, Canada, the UK, Australia sent International Refugee Organisation officers through the camps, encouraging people to emigrate to their countries. And of course, by then my parents had met in a camp, they had married, they had my sister, and emigrated finally to Perth, Western Australia as the first pit stop. So there were a series of ships that took these DPs out of Europe, out of war-torn Europe, and my parents travelled on a ship called Skalgum too. So if you're in Fremantle, anywhere near the Maritime Museum, all of the names of these refugees that came by ship are on the welcome walls in Fremantle in front of the museum. And it's interesting because the academic who was my supervisor, or actually she was more than my supervisor, she was one of my examiners for my thesis that was to do with the Ukrainians through the early 30s. She was the person who set up the welcome walls beautifully. We have a wonderful legacy through her. So my work became, after years as an academic, I left for England for 2 years with the family. When I returned, the rules had changed in the university sector, and one needed to have a doctorate in order to work within the sector. So I had to go back and start further study. I already had 4 degrees by then, so that was a bit disappointing. And in my 50s, I needed to then gain that higher qualification. I had started a completely different doctoral research study, but hosted an academic from Canada who encouraged me to work on this 2-year famine called the Holodomor. Holod meaning hunger or starvation, and mor, as in most European dialects, death. So the Holodomor was a 2-period history in Ukraine, 1932 to 33, where Stalin forcibly starved Ukrainians. He wanted to eradicate them. He wanted to get rid of the nationality of Ukrainians. And so through starvation methodology of removing all foodstuffs, animals, you name it, things were removed. And people were put into collective farms. So they lost property, were moved into collective farms and worked for a pittance, in many cases hardly getting fed whilst they worked. And in fact,
story after story after story.
Yes, so the thesis occurred, and the first book was this one, Silent Memories, Traumatic Lives. And then I was begged by the people whom I interviewed here, the survivors, to please tell their stories. And I realised that many of them had never shared their memories of that 2-year period with their own families. And so once I got over, it was about a 7-year study in the end. It was quite traumatic for me. I then proceeded to rework all of the interview data into narratives. And the book that you're holding in front of you, Holodomor, is the outcome of all of the stories, all of the interviews being rewritten into a narrative format so that people can read the stories. But not just read the stories, they can find out what region they came from. And so if you've been watching the feed of the current war with Russia in Ukraine, you'll recognise a lot of the townships because they are on the eastern side of Ukraine. Again, obviously closest to Russia. So yeah, Mum and Dad arrived here. I went through schooling as normal. I was a ballet dancer. My sister was a musician, and I really enjoy learning. And so I did a few degrees, stickler for punishment, but I loved every minute of it, and then came to doing this particular study, encouraged by a Canadian professor whom I hosted here in 2003, and he told me that the archives in Russia and Ukraine had been opened finally, and this kind of material was finally available for us to peruse and work with. And then a couple of, sorry.
Famous in the middle of Kiev, isn't it? This one here.
Yes, that's actually atop the museum. There's now a Holodomor museum that's underground, and that statue of the young girl is on a plinth. And just as you walk towards the stairs to go downstairs into the museum, she stands there on the plinth. Behind her, you will see a very shady building in that front page, in that cover. There is a building in that area with a gold dome depicting a flame. It's quite amazing. And the museum, sorry.
Yeah. There's also a wall, if I recall, I Googled it, a wall with...
There is a wall, yes, on either side of the stairs.
Of every village that vanished.
Yes, that had been hit through the famine, yes.
But
now called a genocide.
I got a question, is that we've all heard of the Holocaust, 6 million people. In 32, 33, 7 million people died. How come it took like 75 years before we got to hear about this?
Well, have you noticed that the Russian people currently do not believe that there is a war in Ukraine and that Russia is killing people indiscriminately? If you come to understand that you've got Russians within their own nation who have absolutely no idea of what Mr. Putin is doing, you'll understand how that methodology of silencing people through sheer fear silenced the Ukrainians who underwent this horrific genocide in the early 30s, to the point where it was also quite religious, because these people are very religious. The west of Ukraine is Greek Catholic, we're Catholic. The east is Ukrainian Orthodox, and it doesn't matter which church you are a member of, they believed that God was punishing them. And so you've now got the patriarch in Moscow telling his troops that it's a really good idea to kill these Ukrainian Nazis. You can start to understand how the psyche was way back then in 1932-33.
Lesa, even now, didn't I read that there's a split between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. Very much so.
But that's not a recent thing. It happened a few years ago.
No. It's not recent at all.
Yeah.
It's a very different orthodoxy. let me put it quite simply. This is my personal belief. The Ukrainian Orthodoxy it's not based on politics. It is based on religion and faith. Russian Orthodoxy is a completely different ball game. I don't understand how their patriarch can say the things that he's saying to the Russian soldiers. So you can see that it gives them such imprimatur to traumatize, to murder, to rape, to do the vile things that they're doing in Ukraine, because they have the imprimatur of not just their president, but their patriarch.
It's coming from God.
Precisely. Precisely.
One
It's
thing
just,
I noticed in your
extraordinary.
book is that, and it details in great detail very sad, horrific stories about the dreadful things these people went through. And a lot of them seem to get here in about 1955, 1950, 1955. A lot of them seem to get moved out of the DP camps and came here, heavily traumatized.
They started coming out in the late 40s. So the earliest record we have here is, I think, 1947. My family's cohort group was 1950. So the early 50s is when they started to come on not en masse, because there weren't that many, but that is when my family cohort, Ukrainians, came to Western Australia. I'll speak about Western Australia.
The people in your book who came here in that period still have a longing for Ukraine. That's one part.
Yes,
and the other part
yes.
is that when they try and tell their stories, and it's difficult for them to tell their stories to the younger people.
Yes.
And they say the younger people, I'm paraphrasing here, young people seem to me don't get it. They don't seem, because they've always been privileged. They always had 3 meals a day, a roof over their head, a motor car, everything. So they said that they can't
no, they can't fathom. They can't fathom. And I feel that keenly. I grew up with, especially my father, who was very, very involved in Ukrainian church, choirs, you name it. He ran a Ukrainian dancing school, but was also very heavily involved in local politics and organisations. So I used to hear him speak often of the juxtaposition of the sadness of having left his homeland and absolutely loving and cherishing his homeland, but the homeland had been destroyed by Stalin. And so there was no choice but to leave. And in his case, and my mother's case, it was get as far away from that place as possible. And so Western Australia seemed like a really good distance away from war-torn Europe and Stalin, communism. My father absolutely detested the whole notion of communism. But the love of homeland was palpable. He's from the Carpathian Mountains, and when I listened to his stories of skiing through the mountains and just the life he had, I truly felt his loss. And my mother's, she now is 97. She only just went into a nursing home a year ago.
And from that original group that came through in 1950 is still around? I mean, your mother's one.
Right? Look, loosely, I think there are about 6.
Really? Is that all? Eh? Okay.
Yeah.
And how many Ukrainians are there altogether living here in Perth?
Look, we had a group of about 300 families, but there's been a lot of intermarriage. So the statistics are quite different now in terms of Ukrainian married to a Ukrainian. There's very little of that. We've got a lot of intermarriage with people of my children's generation, and they're in their late 30s. There's more Ukrainian marriages at my era, so I'm in my late 60s. So it's been diluted. We now have an influx of new DPs, as you can imagine, with
Yeah.
those who are escaping Ukraine. However, you raise the notion of this longing for homeland. It's had me in tears when I've listened to a couple of mothers with young children, and this, you welcome them here. And on camera, one was asked, what would you like to see happen? What do you want? How can we help you? And she said, I just want to be home with my family, my
Yeah.
husband, but we don't even know if our home is standing. And she can't even speak to her husband on the phone because she doesn't want him to hear her crying. He doesn't want to speak to her on the phone because he doesn't want her to hear the the planes and the sirens.
There is
Um,
one other theme that comes through strongly in this book as well, is that, and was one of the people you interviewed was talking about it, and that was a central part of Ukrainian life is family. Family is like the center point.
it's
There's
the
the religious
core.
part. It's the core.
Yeah,
It's a
it is.
strong
It is
core,
the
and that's why
absolute core. It's
if
the
I look
essence of being a Ukrainian. And
at, if
you
I look
hear
at
it in these young people coming through now, where all they want to do is go back home, be with family. This to them is, oh, it's just heartbreaking. And I don't even have the heart to say to them. I speak about it with my mother. Don't have it in my heart to say to them, it's going to be okay. The Ukrainians here were the first DPs. They made a life, they had a good life, they managed to travel back to Ukraine and meet family, but their life turned out okay.
yeah,
I don't have it in me to say that to them because they are younger. When I interviewed the survivors of the Holodomor, they were in their 80s, so they had had a life.
yeah,
Talking to these young DPs, their lives are just starting. They've just started having families. And
yeah.
here they are, caught up in this war they didn't ask for, in a country they never believed that they needed to travel to,
Yeah.
and there's no family.
It's like
Some of them
history repeating itself.
are
The people,
missing.
your family didn't ask for 1931, 32 hunger, starvation,
Precisely, nor the war,
you
nor the
inflicted
war.
nor the war. The only thing I
Yeah,
ever thought why we never heard about it was that Stalin was very good at actually controlling the media.
of
So
course.
we never heard anything about it,
No,
which I
and
think,
it's happening again. Now, didn't Putin learn his lessons well?
well, yeah, well, I think he's going to have difficulty because every little kid has got one of these, yeah, and the
You would be surprised how he's managed to control the media over there. And can I just give you a couple of examples where
okay,
people who are coming here as the new DPs are telling us they have taken photographs of bombed streets, their homes destroyed, and sending them by phone to their family in Russia. And the families in Russia saying, well, that's just a lot of stories. That's all just made up. And when you turn the camera off, all of those people will stand up off the road and it'll all be tidied up. It's just one big lie.
but tell
This
me,
is how this
are you
is how
tempted now
bad it is. Trust me, this is the truth.
with what's going on over there now? Is that with this book? Are you tempted now to write another one with what's currently going on? With
I'm
what's
about to start it actually because the
okay.
survivors are young and their memories are fresh. So watch this space.
So just tell the folks about what you've written so far. I know this. You mentioned the other book, and
So the first book,
what's
Silent.
fact, what's fiction, and what's And what's non-fiction?
Okay, so this is from my thesis, Silent Memories, Traumatic Lives. And
Yeah.
then the book that you've been holding up, Holodomor.
Yeah.
And the full title is Silent Voices of the Starved Children. And then I've been working on getting that out to the general public. But 2 years ago, when COVID hit, I also call it disabled loosely, where I had a broken wrist that needed surgery twice over. And suddenly with COVID, I'm housebound. I work from home anyway. I'm housebound. I do some teaching. I teach life writing. But life had come to a bit of a standstill, as it had for most of us around Australia. So,
But just back up a bit there. So do you have a
yeah,
day job still, or what?
I teach life writing privately. I am retired from the university sector. So I do workshops wherever I'm called, and life writing is really teaching people how to write their own life stories, because I became so adept at it with all of the Ukrainian interviews. It's just part and parcel of what I do. So those two books are the non-fiction.
How to write it their own story, put it all down on paper. Is it?
You know,
Okay.
the joy of it was that I did the interviews, but alongside of it, I was doing the research. So I was looking at a lot of Ukrainian language survivor stories that were coming out of Ukraine. And I travelled back there 4 times to interview academics. There is a watershed publication by someone called Robert Conquest, and he had a working colleague called James Mace. Now, James Mace found most of the information out about the Holodomor. He was the hardworking
Academic.
He was the guy who was really doing the hard yards. Now, he ended up living in Ukraine and marrying a Ukrainian literature artist, author. She's amazing. He passed away only a few years ago, and I was given access to his library of resources. It was still in their home. I suspect it's now, golly, I hope it's caretaken somewhere, but I believe that it was going to be put into one of the university libraries. Now, where it's gone, I'm not quite sure at this stage. But she was wonderful. She gave me access to that material, to those resources. So
when do you actually get time to write? When do you do your writing? First in the morning, late at night?
that's interesting. I don't know if this is common to women who raise children, but I became so adept having to mark assignments, big assignments, university assignments, when the children and my husband had gone to bed. I would be up doing all of the other chores, but also working on the assignments. And I became so accustomed to just working very late at night. I've become such a night owl. I cannot write through the day. I work at night, and it's just something I think that you develop. When do you write, Mike?
I'm 5:30 in the morning. I start. I get up. I wake up at 5:30. I get my coffee and I go straight to the desk. I have this phrase I say: I got to get on the bus first thing. If I don't get on the bus, and start, But I've got a little quirky habit. So I'm like a Pavlovian dog. So I set my alarm for 50-minute sprints. Okay, and then I put on that. There's a thing in Mozart for studying and relaxing. I put on that, so it's so low, it's like elevator music. And once that starts, then I'm away. But what habits do you have? Do you have little habits like that with your writing?
Well, by the time I sit down, I feel absolutely knackered.
I was going to say, I don't know how you do it at night.
Oh, look, and I had the added horrors of having children who were swimmers. One was a national swimmer. So my by 5 o'clock, I was already at the swimming pool with the kids swimming, and I was under my doona trying to catch a few extra sleeps before I had to get them home and fed and get everybody off to school, work, and everywhere. And then I had classes on at 9 o'clock at uni. So, look, you've just got to find a way to do these things, as you know. And yes, when I sat down at night, I would be very tired. However, I have a brain that doesn't stop all day. So all day I've got ideas, absolutely not, I can't say floating around. I have ideas that are just bouncing around, and I can't wait to actually sit down at night. Sometimes I'd have to start to take notes through the day just so that I didn't forget what I was thinking about.
Have you thought about writing fiction?
Well, I did go into writing fiction. I wrote children's books, but my children's books are based on the Holodomor, on the famine, and I call them soft histories. So the first one actually came up as #1 on Amazon last year. The second one.
How many of those are there?
So I wrote one, and then my publisher, whom you know, she said, "Could you do a series?" And I said, "Just let me at it." So the second one came along fairly quickly. The third one is with my illustrator, Veronica Rook, as we speak. The fourth one is actually in her laptop, but I pushed the third one in before it for a specific reason, and this is quite unique, and you probably have the same experiences as an author. I have this uncanny knack of hitching onto an idea or a concept, as I did with the first children's book. And that one is based on one of the interviewees that I had, one of the survivors, and I came up with Bubba Stooks.
Okay.
So her story was, all of them were tragic, all 42 stories were tragic. One part of her story was that she and her twin broke into a geese pen. They were so hungry. The mother wasn't able to bring food home from working at the collective farm. So these two little girls had to fend for themselves, much like what's going on in Ukraine as well now. And so they broke into a geese pen at one of the collective farms and broke eggs and drank the contents. Well, she made herself violently ill. To this day, has never been able to face raw egg. However, she's kept chooks all of these years, since the early 50s to now. She's still alive. She's actually in the nursing home with my mother. She is my children's paternal grandmother. Okay. And so Bubba's Chooks came into being, and it's Bubba Helen. And it's just a delightful photo, because when I gave my illustrator a photograph of her, she absolutely nailed it. And I'll give you a very quick look at Bubba Helen. So this, can you see that? There's Bubba Helen.
Yeah.
And she actually looks pretty much like that. Okay. So that was the first book, and
have you taken these to schools? Have you read these at schools or anything? Taken them to schools?
I have been reading them to children at different places, yes.
But like schools or where?
Sorry?
Whereabouts have you been reading them?
Primary schools. Last week I was at Child Australia in Lockridge. Okay. And prior to that, it was in Hyde Park to a group of children.
Okay, nice.
So, yeah, I don't do it often, but if I'm asked or called upon to do it, I'm very happy to go and share my stories, because I tend to do a lot of animation and get the kids clapping like books and, you know.
What's the children's reaction to the stories?
Oh, they're quite intrigued. For a start, you know, the question is, who knows what this word Bubba means? Yeah. And one of the schools that I was at was a very mixed ethnic primary school, and there were a couple of children who had Bubbas in their mix, And then we
Oh,
talk about, what do you call your grandmother when we realise that the name is Ukrainian for grandmother? Then it's, well, what do you call your grandmother? And there's Nan or Nonna, all sorts of
yeah.
titles came out. It was very interesting. But these books teach children about Ukrainian customs, if you like, and names. All of the Chuks have a Ukrainian name. So it's a Baba and four Chuk.
Okay.
And so the second story that emanated out of that was actually my mother. And my mother is kind of more cityfied. So if I pull up a photograph of both of them together, there's Baba Helen and there's
Okay.
Baba Stafka. So this book
Okay.
is Baba Stafka and the Magic Chook. So she turns up with this chook,
Okay.
and in fact there are chooks like that. So that's a sweet little story, but what's interesting about it is right at the end of it, and I'll give the game away, but that's okay. She lays Ukrainian Easter eggs, which are called pisanki.
No, that's funny.
And so it's an intriguing story of how can a chook possibly lay eggs like that, and where did she lay them, and all sorts of things. And at the start of my books, I always put a map of Ukraine and the surrounding countries, because I have found that children actually ask, if you've got a story like this that takes them into a different country or ethnicity, they actually want to know where that place is. So there's a map, and there's always things at the end of the book that teachers can pick up. There's drawings they can do. There's poetry they can read in both Ukrainian, phonics, or English. There's a translation. So it gives teachers a bit of a tool to use with children in
I
teaching
wonder,
language.
in reading all of the stories, right, that are in the book I showed, is that I had one thought going through my head, and just to put a thought to you is that I still have always been interested in Genghis Khan with what he actually did, and I've read a lot about the history of what he did. But a couple of guys have actually made a crack at actually, in a novel form, a fictionalized version of it. So you really get, they've got all the stuff of how they lived and whatever, but it sort of gets you to a lot closer to empathize with what they did. It's not as clinical as reading about how they went about warfare and how they lived and whatever. So I wonder if you thought about taking one of these people in the book and taking it from beginning all the way through the day by day privation that they went to, because it didn't happen. Well, it happened very quickly, relatively, but I mean, as to what actually happened. Like if you're a Kirkle, a landowner, is that the right pronunciation? Kirkle?
Kurkul, kurkul.
A landowner.
The Russian is kulak.
Oh, okay. They took everything away. Okay, your land, everything. If you're educated, you're at risk as well. So, and then that's because they thought they were the ones most likely to dissent. But if you took one life from when that person was a little child, and all the way through that privation of how it actually happened, what they saw, because maybe because I write fiction, is that you write things that you hope people will empathize with, and they tend to empathize with protagonists, when they face conflict and those sort of things. And in these stories of yours, there's plenty of conflict. It's not short of that, for people to empathize with. I know, I'm just putting it to you, if you've thought about doing something like that.
The stories in that big book began when they were aged 5, 6.
Yeah.
And when you do interviews like this with people, you leave it open. So apart from asking all of the regular questions like your date of birth, where you lived, how many siblings did you have in your family, and so on and so forth, and the details of where they lived, so their regions, their village names, their oblasts or their states. So their stories came about when you asked one question. What do you remember of those 2 years? This is how it started. They did not just focus on the 2 years. So this is what you have to understand. This was their story, and to a person, they started telling me their story from when they were little children and what they saw. Their mates at school who suddenly weren't appearing at school.
Yeah, I read that.
Um,
So you'd say
so,
most of these things are over a 2-year period.
so sorry, I'll just get rid of that off my screen. So,
You say most of the stories are like over a 2-year period. That's where
their story started when they started telling me the answer to that question of what do you remember of those 2 years. It wasn't just the 2 years. They started from the time that they were little kids watching what had happened during those years, and their story finished the day that I was sitting in front of them. So you have a choice of either stopping them and insisting that they concentrate on just those 2 years. But when you're listening to these harrowing stories, and when they are telling you that they must be punished so badly by God to have had to live through something like this, you make a decision. Am I going to oppress these people? No, I'm just going to let them tell their story because what they're telling me is important to them. And so you get out of it. So for the thesis and for the very first book, there are lots of analysis data that comes out of their interviews. So the interviews were scrutinised, and all of the data that's specifically related to the 2 years has been pulled out. Whereas what you've got in the big book is just their entirety, if you like. And do I want to go back? I don't. There is a lot of material now that can be read by adults. When I was doing this work, there was very little. Now archives have opened. There's a lot of material around. A lot of scholars have now been doing this research. I don't wish to go there anymore. I worked on this material from 2003, and I finally had my thesis conferred in 2010. And by that stage, I can tell you, Mike, I had done and read enough. For me, mentally, it became such a challenge that in order to get that big book published, I had to really work hard to sit down and
because of
rework
emotion.
the material.
Was
I
it emotion?
enlisted the support. Look, I enlisted the support of a wonderful gentleman at my university at Curtin, and I gave him some of the interviews, and I said, "Look, can you please sit down and write up some of this material, and then I'll go through it because I'm the one who has the translation." I'll go through and I'll make sure that it's okay. So between the two of us, we got through the 42 interviews. But I can tell you by the end of it, I was ready to slit my throat.
But it must have been emotionally draining.
It
All of
was.
this.
It was harrowing. It was harrowing. And now, when I've got so many people expecting me to talk about the current DP situation and the Russian invasion,
Yeah.
I'm going through the same stuff. I'm having to stop watching news feeds. I'm finding that quite mentally debilitating again. I'm not sure would I be the same had I not done that research work. I think I would be. I think it's just my psyche. I am very emotional. I am totally infuriated that we can't stop Putin with what he's doing to these people. And yet I know that I have to start this work again, but I'm going to do it quite differently. I will have,
But
I'll call
putting
them
these,
my army on the ground.
but doing this, was this some sort of closure for you with a lot of things as well, or what?
There's no closure with this stuff.
No, not. I guess not. But I wanted to
There's
ask
no
you,
closure.
when you were interviewing these people, for the book, were they something? I don't know. Maybe I'm misreading it incorrectly here, but was it? Were you like one of the first people to ever sit down with them since they got here to get them,
Yes,
because you are Ukrainian, to get them to open
yes,
up and talk about
yes,
it because they felt
yes.
you understood, whereas somebody like me, they would have thought I wouldn't get it, and they wouldn't
You would
open up.
never have been given these stories. I will tell you that much.
Yeah, but why is that?
And the
Because
and
they
the
just
reason they were so trusting of me is that my father was so involved in all of the communities, in the Baptist, in the Orthodox, and in the Catholic communities. Everybody knew him, and they got to know me because I was very involved in a lot of our ethnic events and so on. And I was also an academic. And so there was a semblance of trust that I would treat this material with honour,
and respect.
which I did. It was, and it's quite interesting, Mike. I could have gone through any other university here in Perth to do this research work, but I decided to do it through the University of Notre Dame. Why?
Why?
Because it's a religious university. And I thought that these people would be far more comfortable if they felt that this material was being handled through a religious university. At the end of the day, it's just that they were elderly, their life was coming to an end, and they wanted their story to be told. So in the beginning, I had many of them who did not allow me to use their names. And so for the first book, Silent Memories, it is full of pseudonyms. But I had permission to use their correct names upon their death. However, in some cases, in that big book of narratives, the pseudonyms are still being used because they just did not wish their names to ever be used. Why? Because of the fear of one day the KGB coming down on them like a ton of bricks. And guess what? Look at what Putin's doing. And let me tell you a very interesting story. We have a young mother here with 2 children. Her husband encouraged her to leave Ukraine. He drove her to the border and off she went with a little toddler under the age of 2 and her oldest daughter, whom I think she's about 3.5, 4. Off she went into Poland without him because, as you know, the men are not permitted to leave. So he's left behind, but he got her out of the country because she was a journalist. And the Russian soldiers have a list of journalists and they were going to systematically execute them.
Yep.
And he wanted his wife to live. She's here in Perth.
He's very courageous, and actually,
Yeah.
right, a number of courageous stories going on there.
Oh, you've no idea. It's heart-wrenching, heartbreaking. Oh.
And the sad thing, we have these silly traitor. I said traitor agreement. Now that's a Shakespearean slip. I said traitor agreement, but to say treaty agreements like with the likes of NATO, where we've got all of these armaments on the border, and they won't do anything because they have these
stupid
rules.
Agreements. Yeah.
But yet Putin said, Someone made an interesting point the other day, is that another reason why they got to stop him is that unless they do, every other little dictator thinks, oh, well, they won't do anything.
Oh, yeah.
He'll march into some other country that doesn't have a treaty with somebody else.
Well, you've got, there's a very little enclave on the border of Ukraine called Transnistria, and then there's Romania. But I read a feed today where is it Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan is refusing to support this whole notion of war with Putin, because obviously they disagree with what's going on, but they're also scared because what's he going to do to them? I think it's Kazakhstan, because they are under his umbrella. So, they're all very scared because if he's gone in and just so blatantly, with impunity, managed to
Yeah,
cause such mayhem, um, what is he going to do in their countries? And I believe Finland is starting to ramp up their membership to NATO.
yeah, I saw
Um,
that because they have the longest
yeah,
border.
so it's interesting because this particular young woman, the journalist, she was telling me that she moved out of Poland because Poland was absolutely full of these people trying to get away. She moved on further into Germany and stayed there for, I think, just a week before she decided that she would try and get out to Australia, to Western Australia. And she said, even in Germany, the mood was very nervous. It was very interesting to hear her comments that Germany was feeling quite nervous. And I remember watching the new Chancellor talk to the Bund. It was a very early morning feed. I'm always up in the early morning. I haven't gone to bed yet. But I was actually quite intrigued by what he was saying, how Germany must now cut its ties, start to source its own energy sources, because they're
Oh, yeah,
so dependent on Russia, as many of the European countries are. So to
Gazprom.
hear this German Chancellor speak so openly and vehemently against or for cutting these sorts of ties,
Yeah,
especially with Russia,
I
to me
heard that.
was intriguing.
It's not clear the logistics of how he's going to do that. But Lisa, we've sort of
Mm.
run out of time here, but it's been fascinating.
Mm.
I want you to come back again and tell us more, particularly as what's going to happen over there, maybe in about 6 weeks, 2 months or so. We can get you back on the air
Mm.
again and
Love
see what's
to.
going on because a lot.
Absolutely love to.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank
Wonderful
you
chatting
to
to you.
your viewers.
Yeah.
I am available. I do a lot of guest speaking. People are intrigued, intrigued with the work that I'd already done. And of course, now they're seeking more information of what is going on in Ukraine as we speak, and the similarities of the past of the early 30s to now 22
Very similar.
is just palpable. So
That
thank you
old.
very much for this opportunity.
Okay, Lisa. Enjoy the rest of
Bye
your
for
evening.
now.
Bye,
See you.
bye, Lisa.
Thank you.
Bye.